In the styles of Asiatic archery, there is a technique called Khatra, and you will often see thumb shooters perform what looks like to be a forward flick of the hand. It's a bit more complex than that, but you'll see it as this forward movement. And Khatra has been actually quite divisive depending on who uses it and how useful it actually is. The opinions cover a spectrum from worthless, superficial, superfluous movement to mystical god tier, makes every shot perfect. So today's video is going to address some of the misconceptions about Khatra, especially in whether or not Khatra actually allows you to shoot any arrow. Firstly, what do we mean by any arrow, or the right kind of arrow? Archers today, as with the old days, understand that not all arrows are the same. Arrows may be different in length, in weight, in stiffness or thickness, and all these factors combine to form what is called arrow spine. Arrow spine is our understanding of how much the arrow has to flex or can flex. And this is vital in understanding how to choose the right arrow to your bow. If you don't choose the right arrow, then the arrow won't clear the bow properly, and therefore it will deflect left or right, which leads to inaccuracy. When you pick the right arrow shaft, the right spine for your bow, it will flex or oscillate around the bow, it will clear it fine, and therefore fly much straighter, lose less energy, and therefore maintain its speed, therefore shoot further or shoot faster at shorter distances, and so on. So it is highly desirable that we find the right arrow for every bow we use. And that's the case with modern target archery and any form of traditional or historical archery. And this fact was known to historical archers too. The historical texts that we have do discuss differences in arrow weight and size. In Arab archery, it does have a chapter on the selection of arrows based on weight and wood. It doesn't go to specifically things like thickness, but it was well understood that different weights have different purposes. In the English text Toxophilus by Roger Sham, it does go into great detail about the selection of arrows as appropriate to draw weight. It has chapters referencing the size of the arrow, specifically that a big-breasted arrow should be shot from a bow that is aimed over the arm. That is, for a bow that is high draw weight and therefore shoot flatter, you need a big-breasted arrow, which is a thicker shaft, to therefore not shatter in flight. Now, if you want to see another video about big breast, see this video up here. That aside, as we said, it was known that to have ideal arrow flight, then you would try to match the right arrow. This wasn't vital. You can still shoot a bow reasonably accurately without the perfect arrow. And of course, when we think about arrow manufacturing back then, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't a science, it wasn't necessarily consistent. You might have to find different arrows from different people, from your enemies perhaps, when they shoot at you. So it might not be the same kind of arrow. And even if there were the similar kinds of arrows, then they might have different quality, different straightnesses, some flaws. So there's always going to be a level of inconsistency between arrows, even of the same kind, and that's something we accept. In modern times, we can manufacture arrows to be very straight to 0.0001 inch of inconsistency and straightness. So these are really consistent, and the more you pay, the more consistent it is. Otherwise, you start seeing more variations in flight, which are beyond your control. But that leads us to the topic of Khatra. Khatra, as a traditional technique, has several functions. Part of it is to reinforce good form, expansion, direction, and follow through. And often you see what's called a front Khatra or forward Khatra, where the bowman tips the bow forward like that. You also see what's called a side Khatra, which primarily focuses on the arrow clearance, which is actually the main reason why people use Khatra. So you see a sideways movement, more like that. And some archers will combine a bit of both. So there's a forward movement and a side movement. So you end up with something like that. So those are the three kind of flicks or Khatra follow-throughs you'll see. And each one has a slightly different purpose, but they all serve a similar goal, and that is to provide enough clearance for the arrow from this side of the bow. And Khatra does make a difference. Not always the right difference if you don't do it correctly and well, but it does make a difference. So I'm going to shoot at tolerable range here. I'll shoot one high, one low, to one without Khatra, one with Khatra, and we'll see the different effects on the arrow shaft as it goes in. So the first one, no Khatra, and the second one with Khatra. There actually is a slight difference in how the arrows have gone in. So if we straighten up over here, this first arrow is slightly off, pointing this way. This one is a straighter flight. And of course, that's only at around 1.5 meters, so it's not much of a difference. But you can imagine at longer distances, that difference will be a lot more. So it's not fair to say that Khatra does nothing. It does have an impact, but a lot of it lies on, are you doing Khatra correctly? So good execution of Khatra is very complicated and requires a high level of skill. It involves the timing of the release so that the bow can move out of the way of the arrow without the arrow being thrown off. Too soon and the arrow is flung off to the side, too late and it hits the bow anyway. So if I do it correctly and get cleaner flights because there's less contact, does that mean I can literally shoot any spine of arrow? And remember that I can already shoot any kind of arrow from this bow, assuming it's the right length and it's not too light. I can shoot a heavy, thick-spined arrow or a thinner arrow from the same bow. The question more is, can I shoot with the same level of accuracy, with the same clearance? Can I shoot any arrow without any of the penalties of shooting a mismatched arrow, such as deflection or inaccuracy? The answer is, technically, yes, I can, but that's a very big simplification. And a lot of people take this technically yes to the extreme and say, I can virtually shoot every arrow, I can ignore spine and shoot the same. And you can't ignore spine. Spine was a part of the knowledge of how to do archery, and it still is today. And here's the proof. You can see over here on the bow grip, on the arrow pass, and virtually any bow that is well worn, well used will have similar markings here. That's where the arrow is hitting the bow. It is an abrasion mark at over months and years, has worn away the wood of the arrow pass and cut into the fiberglass beneath. And that is a typical sign. You'll see in many of my bows and many other bows that the leather or the pass has scratchings or markings or is worn out. And that has a lot to do with, again, bad technique. That's part of learning. But it also shows that Asiatic bows with thumb draws are not immune to the effects of the wrong spine. When you watch shot in slow motion, you will see arrow deflection. And part of the purpose of having fletchings, of course, is that they will correct flight. So over long distance, it will straighten out, but it will cause a lot of inaccuracy and inconsistency. But you can't ignore arrow spine. That's the point. So when you buy arrows for one of these bows, you should actually aim for what is roughly the right spine rating. Now the measurements will be slightly different because your draw length for thumb draw is often much longer than a conventional Western draw, but the principal spine is still the same. You need the right amount of clearance because these bows, no matter what side you shoot, what technique you shoot, still have to deal with the issue of arrow clearance and the archer's paradox. By matching a roughly right spine with this bow, then you will have just the right clearance. You don't actually need to use Khatra. And again, a lot of the historical styles that don't use Khatra will match the arrow or just deal with the fact that it will deflect. That's a part of compensating for archery. So you don't need to use Khatra, but if you have the right arrow spine, you mostly negate the benefits of it. So therefore, you can still shoot very accurately without using Khatra if the arrow is very well matched. However, Khatra comes from a time where arrows were not well matched, and this reveals a differing philosophy with how different archery cultures address problems. With modern archery, we match the arrow to the bow. So if there's any issues, we change the arrow. And in modern times, we can manufacture carbon fiber or aluminum arrows to precision and with any degree of differences in spine. There are different spine ratings for every draw weight, and you pick the one that is closest match. You do some fine tuning, change the arrow weight or the insert length or cut the shaft shorter, and you get basically a mathematical calculation over the exact kind of arrow you need for your bow. If there's any need to compensate for error, we have things like plunger buttons, which we use for the modern Olympic bows, which are basically springs which mitigate or absorb some of the shock of the arrow being pushed side to side, and therefore it corrects the arrow flight. So modern archery perfects the tool. Historical and especially Asiatic archery have imperfect tools. The bows aren't perfect and the arrows aren't perfect. So what they did instead was to perfect the archer, the person who is casting the arrow. So we are basically, in the form of using Khatra, acting as a shock absorber, as a difference mitigator, as a plunger button, because by using a technique which allows us to control how much the bow moves or opens up, we can compensate for the mismatching of arrows, whether it's your own arrows being flawed or you're picking up other arrows from the ground and shooting them back. It allows you to shoot a greater range of arrows which themselves are not perfectly made. However, it does rely on good execution because we are not plunger buttons. We are not machines, we are not tools. We are people, and therefore our technique is going to be inconsistent no matter what. We are not perfect. And that is the inherent flaw of Khatra. It does rely on good execution each time. It might not be perfect execution, but bad Khatra will have very wayward results. And one of the reasons why you might see arrows flying everywhere on a long distance target is because your Khatra is simply not perfect. It is really, really hard to train yourself to have the perfect follow through each time. And every execution is going to be a slight difference. So that is why, at least from my opinion, Khatra isn't this superb mystical magic technique which makes all arrows fly straight. It potentially can if you are a very skilled master archer. But even the top level archers do not shoot that well. But that is how people dealt with the problem back then. Khatra allows you to make up for the inaccuracies and the inconsistencies with your equipment if you train yourself to a high degree. Modern archery solves that problem by addressing the equipment and making that perfect to a degree. And therefore the archer simply has to execute the ideal shot without much variation in the technique. That's why these things aren't necessarily wrong or different. They're different philosophies and different approaches to addressing the same problem. One fixes the tool, the other fixes the shooter. So in conclusion, you still should be buying or matching the right kind of arrows for your bow. Now, while Khatra can mitigate some errors in your bow and arrows matching, it can also introduce a lot of errors if you don't shoot consistently, and that is often much harder for many people. It does not allow you to simply ignore all spine ratings, shoot any arrow you want. It does give you a bit of variety in or range in what you can shoot. And again, with good Khatra and bad Khatra, you will have varying results. So don't treat Khatra as the fix-it-everything solution. If you train it well as part of your archery style and technique, it can help, but if you do it poorly, it will cause more problems. But to answer the question, can you shoot any arrow spine? Technically, yes, but the closer the spine match, the less it matters. Anyway, I hope you find that interesting and helpful. Thank you all for watching. Do take care of yourselves, and hopefully we'll see you next time.